All right, so today we're talking about thesis statements. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I'm finding this difficult to communicate via video. It's something that we work a lot on in class and have a lot of discussion around, but I'm going to do my best. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out the best way to communicate this to you, so bear with me. And if you find this frustrating, know we're going to work on it continually. So we're going to start with first know that you have already written an essay, right? And so you have that essay in mind and what your thesis is. Feel free to look back at that essay and your thesis to reference as we go through because I'm going to be using that prompt as an example. So we're going to start with what the AP graders are looking for in a thesis statement. At the top of this is what I'm going to show you right here. This is a tool that I use to help you all write thesis statements. And you can use this whenever you write a thesis statement for me. I don't want to hem you into this box. I don't want to like hamper your creativity. There are lots of different ways to write thesis statements. I'm just going to show you this one way that I think really helps you get this one thesis point. Um, but this is not the only way. So if you have different ways of doing things as we go through this process, if you're noticing that your thesis is working fine, then that's totally fine. But I do want you to think about these things as you're creating your thesis statements. So again, here is our rubric for thesis statements. You either get a point for it or you don't, and that makes a big difference. This is always what I start with because if you can get this point, it's much easier to get further points down the line. And if you miss this point, it's super easy, I think, to fix it, to make sure you do these things and get a whole other point added um, to your rubric grade, which is a big deal. And also, if you miss this rubric point, sometimes it messes up your commentary and evidence points because you don't have anything to refer back to. So, super important that we get this right. So, looking at this, it's asking, I've color coded it here. Here are the things it's looking for in a thesis statement for you to get the point. One, responds to the prompt. That may seem obvious, right? Like, of course, you need to respond to the prompt, but you'll be surprised, and I've seen it in the essays I've already looked at of yours, how often you don't respond to the prompt. For instance, in this case, we'll get to this, but our prompt is asking about the speaker's attitude towards love. Some of you did not mention the speaker's attitude in your thesis statement, so that's not responding to the prompt. The lights went out. Next, it needs to be defensible. So, defensible meaning that you can defend it, that you can provide evidence for it. If it's something that's too obvious and like you can't even argue it, like for instance, the sky is blue. Okay, I mean, are you really going to argue that? Like, there's not really an argument against that, right? So it needs to be something you can defend. And not only that, but that you can actually provide evidence for. If you go way out on a limb and present an interpretation that you just can't provide evidence for, that would mean that that is not defensible. Then presents an interpretation. So some of you might, actually, this is a problem that most of you are going to face. If you don't get this point, it's probably because of this. Some of you will respond to the prompt in that you're talking about the speaker's attitude towards love, but you don't say what that speaker's attitude is. So you're not really providing an interpretation. You're saying the speaker talks about love, or Shakespeare shows the speaker's attitude towards love, but that's not an interpretation. You're not saying what that attitude is. And then finally, we have may establish a line of reasoning. So this one, notice that word may here. So this one's a little wishy-washy. Like if you have these first three, you can get this point. This one is actually getting more into your sophistication point, which we'll talk about later. So these first three, the yellow, green, and blue, are the most important. This one I'm also going to talk about because that's towards getting to those super advanced higher scores. So to not get this point means you don't have a defensible thesis, like there's no thesis there. The thesis only restates the prompt. So it doesn't actually it just restates it without actually providing an interpretation. It is just a summary, or it doesn't respond to the prompt at all. So I've highlighted through this document which areas correspond to which prompt parts of this rubric. So responding to the prompt. How do you make sure you respond to the prompt? Well, first let's start with analyzing the prompt and making sure we're addressing exactly what it's asking. So we start with the prompt. Here it is. We've seen it already. Read Shakespeare Sonnet 130. How does Shakespeare develop the speaker's attitude towards love? Keep in mind literary devices, blah, blah, blah. So, the first thing we'll ask you to do on this form is to find the topic or the prompt motif. Basically, what I'm asking for is what is the main thing? What is the one thing in a word or phrase that this prompt is asking for? So, you see in this one, I've decided that it's the speaker's attitude towards love. That's our question. How does Shakespeare develop the speaker's attitude towards love? That is the main thing we're talking about here. So we've isolated that, the speaker's attitude towards love. That's pretty easy. Okay. So now let's get on to our blue part, which is presenting an interpretation. So in order to make sure we're actually presenting an interpretation, we need to address that prompt and say something about it. Say something about this topic, the speaker's attitude towards love. So I've kind of set it up as a fill in the blank. What is whatever this topic is? So basically, you can just take this that you put in this box and put that here. What is the speaker's attitude towards love? So I've written that question down here. What is the speaker's attitude towards love? And here's where you brainstorm answers, because if you do not have an answer to that question in your thesis, then you are not presenting an interpretation. So I brainstormed a few ideas. I separated them with slashes. You can do however you want. This is a place to think about it. So no wrong answers here. You just kind of type and whatever. So I thought about, okay, what is the speaker's attitude towards love? True love is rare. You have to know someone to love them. Seeing the real person is love. Those are a few things I thought about. And when you do this, brainstorm however much you need to. And when you get to a stopping point, you need to distill it down to a word or a phrase. So, looking at this, true love is rare. You have to know someone. Seeing the real person is love. And then trying to answer this question, what is the speaker's attitude towards love? I decided to go with the word realistic. So the speaker has a realistic attitude towards love. So you all may agree with me on that interpretation. Maybe you don't. You can kind of go with whatever makes most sense to you here, but this is my example. There are lots of other ways we could describe his attitude towards love. Like, I don't know, he has a grounded attitude towards love. He has a um, like maybe some of you see that interpret this poem differently and like think he has like a negative attitude towards love, like it's overblown or something like that, or a hyperbolic attitude towards love. There's lots of different interpretations. I'm going with this one. So, but that's the important thing is I have to have an interpretation. So this blue thing here, present an interpretation. My interpretation is his attitude towards love is realistic. So, moving on, how does the author show this? So, this is corresponding to it being defensible. So, here's where we're starting to get into my evidence. Now, I will say, as far as the thesis statement goes, this part you do not actually have to write in your thesis. This is the part where you've seen this before. Like if you have a thesis statement, you present your main point and then like your three body paragraphs. This is kind of the three body paragraphs part of this. And I will say in AP writing, I generally don't expect three body paragraphs. I expect two. You can't have just one because then it's not really an essay. But if you have two really well developed body paragraphs for the type of writing we're doing, that would be totally fine. You're welcome to do more than two body paragraphs, but I usually stick with two. So, how does the author show this? Um, that's where we're getting at this. And again, and so it says that here's where your body paragraphs and possibly literary devices come into play. You should not always write about literary devices in here, but sometimes you do. It depends on how you're dividing it up, how you're answering the question. So, how does the author show this? Um, how does he show the speaker's attitude towards love is realistic? I'm deciding to go with hyperbole. I think all those metaphors where he's like, um, black wires grow on her head and stuff like that. I find that hyperbolic. I think he's exaggerating. And I think that shows it's kind of ironic because I think he's showing his attitude is realistic, even though he's using unrealistic comparisons. But I think that's the point, right? Is that he's using these unrealistic comparisons to show how most people are not realistic, but he is. So, I think hyperbole is one way he shows that. And then here I say trope subversion. So, we talked about what a sonnet is normally like, and how it's normally hyperbolic and whatever. And I think by subverting that, by using a sonnet, but using it for a more realistic idea of love, he's emphasizing that point. So you can put as many things as you want here. You're probably going to want to settle on two that you basically will end up using as your body paragraphs. So, back to my point about putting this in your thesis statement, you do not necessarily have to include this part in your thesis statement. This part up here, your thesis statement needs to be defensible, which means basically in the rest of your body, you have to include that, but you don't actually have to state that outright in your thesis statement. I like doing it. It helps give me direction for my paper. So I would suggest you do it, but you don't have to. So those are the things that we really need to make sure we know for a thesis. Stating it outright, we really just need these two. I suggest including all three. And then this last part, I find it extremely important. And I think in previous versions of AP grading, it was absolutely necessary. I think that based on this rubric with that may there, I think you can get away without doing it. But I don't know why you would, because if you're trying to get the highest score, I think you should go ahead and do this. And I think it will help you. So, this last one, why is it important? So, we have the answer, we have our interpretation, realistic attitude towards love, and how we're doing that, how Shakespeare does that through hyperbole and subversion. But now, why is it important? This is that extra step that really takes your essay above and beyond. So actually have a link here to a document about literary theme. When it asks why is it important, it's really asking you how is this important to an overall theme in the poem or novel or whatever it is. So I have a link here to a document about literary themes. And you can take some time to look at that, but I'm going to emphasize a few main points here. A literary theme is expressible in the form of a statement with a subject and a predicate. So a literary theme is not, like it says here, loyalty. That's not a theme, that's a topic. Or even loyalty to one's country. It's a topic. You need a complete sentence here. So an example is loyalty to one's country often inspires heroic self sacrifice. A complete sentence. A literary theme is also a statement about life, like a generalizable thing. It's not specific to the book, it is about life in general. So instead of saying Macbeth, like an example, Macbeth is so out of control in his desire for power that he kills King Duncan, blah, blah, blah. Like it's showing that's specific to a book. Rather, you could say, when one's ambition goes unchecked, should be by moral constraints, destruction of himself and others may ensue. So this is not specific to characters. This is an overall generalization about life. That's where you're getting at the importance. It's showing something about life, not about the small world of the novel. And then finally, we have the generalization is not larger than justified by the terms of the story. So this is mostly saying like you have to have something that actually makes sense for the story. Like not something you want to avoid these terms like all, every, always, like love always conquers all. Like that's pretty like always, you know? So make sure it's within reason. And the last one I want to emphasize here is avoid cliche. Like you can't judge a book by its cover. That may very well be what a poem or a novel or whatever is trying to say, but that's a cliche. Say it a different way. Okay, find a more unique way to say that. Something like um, judging people often leads to missed opportunities, something like that. So, avoiding those cliches. So, when we get back to our thing here, here's why I think it's important that the speaker's attitude towards love is realistic is that it shows that flattery should not be confused with true love. Okay, so we're getting into a complete statement here. Flattery should not be confused with true love. That part right here, flattery should not be confused with true love, is a complete statement. It is relevant to the poem. It's not a cliche. Okay, so all of that. How do you put it together into a single thesis statement? So I've divided up the boxes. So notice I've divided where, who, what, how, why. So if you look up here, we have the what, the how, and the why. So you basically just fill those in what, how, why. And the where and the who is just like the text and the author. Okay. So in Sonnet 130, who, Shakespeare, what develops the speaker's realistic attitude towards love, how, through hyperbolic metaphor and trope subversion, why, showing that flattery should not be confused with true love. So putting it all together, and you might have, I put it in a format that makes sense as a whole sentence. You might have to work through that to make it make a sentence. But here's my final version. In Sonnet 130, Shakespeare develops the speaker's realistic attitude towards love through hyperbolic metaphor and trope subversion, showing that flattery should not be confused with love. So take a second and look at this um, thesis statement and compare it to the one that you wrote with this same prompt. How does it compare? You can pause now in just a second, pause before I move on, and um, look at those and see what the difference is. So pause and then come back. And I want you to try to use the blank version of this that I have linked for to do this on your own. And you will submit that to me and refer back to the instructions video if you need any help with that.